Rain fell over Chicago like a verdict, hard, cold, and without mercy. Dante Moretti sat in the back of his armoured Escalade, watching the city blur past the window in streaks of red and gold. 10 years of running the most feared family in the Midwest had taught him to read danger in silence, in the way a room went still before violence, in the way a man's hands trembled before he lied. Tonight, the silence in the car felt wrong. His driver, Nico, kept glancing at the rear-view mirror, and Dante's guards in the follow car were too quiet on the radio. He didn't know yet that in the next 4 minutes his entire life would split into a before and an after. "Slow down through the underpass," Dante said, not looking up from his phone. "Roads are slick." Nico eased off the gas. That was the only reason they saw it happen, instead of becoming part of it. A silver sedan came fishtailing around the curve ahead, its headlights swinging wildly across the wet asphalt. Another car, black, low, moving with the kind of aggression that had nothing to do with weather, clipped its rear bumper. Metal screamed against metal. The sedan spun once, twice, and slammed into the concrete divider with a sound like the world breaking. "Stop the car," Dante said, already reaching for the door. "Boss," Nico started, "stop the car." He was out before the Escalade fully halted, rain soaking through his suit jacket in seconds, his men fanning out behind him with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had learned to expect ambushes, even in accidents. The black car that had caused the crash didn't stop. It peeled off into the dark, tail lights vanishing around the bend, and something about the deliberate way it left made the hair rise on the back of Dante's neck. This hadn't been an accident. Not entirely. But that thought evaporated the moment he reached the wrecked sedan and saw her. The driver's side was crushed inward, glass scattered like ice across the pavement, and behind the shattered windshield, a woman was slumped against the deployed airbag, blood threading down from her temple. Her hands, even unconscious, were folded protectively over the swell of her stomach. Pregnant. 8 months, maybe more. "Get the door," Dante barked, already prying at the mangled frame with his bare hands. Metal bit into his palms. He didn't feel it. 2 of his men rushed to help, and together they wrenched the door open with a shriek of tortured steel. He reached in to check her pulse, his fingers finding the side of her throat, and the second his skin touched hers, something in him went completely still. He knew that face. 10 years had changed it, sharpened the cheekbones, adding faint lines of worry at the corners of her eyes, stolen the softness of youth and replaced it with something more haunted. But he would have known her in a crowd of 10,000 women, blind by touch alone. Elena. The name detonated in his chest like a bullet he hadn't seen coming. "Boss," one of his men said, "ambulance is 6 minutes out. We should move her ourselves. The hospital's—" "I said get the med kit," Dante snapped, his voice rougher than he intended. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat again, needing to be sure this wasn't a hallucination born of 10 years of unfinished grief. Her pulse fluttered, weak but steady beneath his fingertips. Alive, barely, but alive. He looked at her stomach again, and something cold and possessive twisted through him, even as his rational mind rejected the thought forming at the edges of his consciousness. Not mine, can't be mine. 10 years. And yet, the protectiveness that surged through him in that moment had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with the memory of a 19-year-old girl who used to fall asleep in his arms on the roof of his father's warehouse, dreaming out loud about a life neither of them ever got to have. "Helena," he said, low, urgent, his hand cradling the side of her face with a gentleness that would have shocked every man who feared him. "Helena, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. For one unbearable second, hazel eyes, glassy with pain and shock, found his face. Recognition flickered through the fog of her concussion, her lips parting around a word that never fully formed. "Dan." And then she went under again, her body slack against his arms as he lifted her free of the wreckage, careful of her stomach, careful of the baby that was not his, and yet already felt like the single most important thing in the world to protect. "Get my car," Dante said. "We're not waiting for an ambulance. I want her at Northwestern Memorial in 4 minutes, and I want a name on that black sedan by morning." Nico didn't argue. In 10 years, no one in the organization had learned to argue with the tone Dante Moretti used when something mattered enough to make his hands shake. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, too late, too slow. Dante carried Elena Marchetti through the rain toward his car, her blood soaking into his shirt, her heartbeat fragile beneath his palm, and the ghost of a promise he'd made her a decade ago. "I will always come for you," burning back to life in his chest, like something that had never actually died, only slept. He had spent 10 years telling himself he'd stopped loving her. He had been lying the entire time. The hospital lights were too bright, too clinical, a harsh contrast to the darkness Dante usually moved through. He stood outside the trauma bay with his jaw locked and his ruined hands shoved into his pockets, watching through a strip of window as a team of doctors worked over Elena's unconscious body. Dr. Whitfield, the hospital's chief of trauma surgery, and a man who owed Dante Moretti more favours than he could ever repay, came out 15 minutes later, peeling off bloody gloves. "She's stable," Whitfield said. "Mild concussion, 3 fractured ribs, laceration on the scalp that needed 12 stitches. She was lucky. If that airbag hadn't deployed correctly, the baby," Dante said. It came out sharper than he meant. Whitfield's brows lifted a fraction, some private curiosity flickering behind his glasses before professionalism reasserted itself. "The baby's heart rate dipped during the accident, but it stabilized. 34 weeks. If we need to deliver early because of the trauma, the baby has a good chance, but right now, mother and child are both out of immediate danger." Dante nodded once, sharp and controlled, the way he nodded when he received confirmation that a shipment had arrived safely, except his pulse was a war drum against his ribs, and he hated how much he needed to hear those words. "I want a private room. Top floor. I want 2 of my men outside her door at all times, and I don't want her name in any system that can be searched by outsiders." "Dante," Whitfield's voice dropped, turned careful. "Do you know this woman?" The question hung in the sterile air between them. Do you know this woman? He had memorized the exact shade of her eyes in candlelight. He had learnt the rhythm of her laugh well enough to recognize it from 3 rooms away. He had once believed, with the reckless certainty only a 22-year-old could possess, that he would marry her, that they would build a life somewhere far from his father's blood-soaked empire, somewhere with sunlight and no guns. He had believed it until the morning he woke up and she was simply gone. No note, no goodbye, no trace, as if she'd been erased from the world, along with every plan they'd ever whispered into each other's skin. "I used to," Dante said finally, "a long time ago." Whitfield studied him a moment longer, then nodded and didn't push. Some men had learnt, over the years, exactly how far they were permitted to look into Dante Moretti's past before the door slammed shut. He was given the room number 20 minutes later. He stood outside it for a long time before he let himself go in. And when he finally did, the sight of her small and pale against white sheets, an IV taped to the back of her hand, hit him harder than any bullet ever had. She looked exactly like herself, and nothing like herself at all. The girl he remembered had been soft-eyed and easily delighted, quick to laugh, quicker to trust. The woman in the bed had faint lines of exhaustion carved beneath her eyes, even in sleep. The kind that came from years of carrying something heavy alone. He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat, elbows on his knees, staring at her hand where it rested over the blanket-covered curve of her stomach. "Where did you go, Elena?" he murmured, so quiet it barely disturbed the air. 10 years. Not one word. I looked for you, do you know that? I spent 2 years looking for you before I made myself stop. The monitor beeped steadily beside them, indifferent to the confession. He should leave. He should walk out that door, hand her file to someone else. Let this be a coincidence he processed from a distance, the way he processed everything. A data point, a variable, contained and controlled. That was what a rational boss would do. A boss with enemies circling, with a black sedan that had deliberately run a pregnant woman off the road and vanished into the night, had no business sitting vigil at the bedside of a stranger from his past. But he didn't move. Her fingers twitched against the blanket sometime near midnight, and her eyes opened, slow, unfocused, adjusting to the dim light of the room. She turned her head, and for the second time that night, hazel eyes found his face. This time she didn't lose consciousness. This time she went rigid, her breath catching audibly in her throat, one hand flying instinctively to the swell of her stomach as if to shield it from him. "No," she whispered, her voice cracked and raw. "No, this isn't. You're not supposed to be here." Elena. Her name felt like something sacred and dangerous in his mouth after 10 years of silence. "You're safe. You were in an accident. You're at Northwestern Memorial. The baby's okay." Her eyes filled instantly, tears spilling before she could stop them, though whether from relief or terror or the sheer impossible shock of his face after a decade, he couldn't tell. "Dante," she said, and it broke something loose in his chest to hear his own name in her voice again. "You have to leave, please. If he finds out you were the one who... If who finds out?" Her mouth closed. Fear moved behind her eyes like something with teeth, and Dante felt every protective instinct he'd buried for 10 years come roaring back to life at once. "Eleanor," he said again, low and lethal, the voice that made grown men in his organization go pale. "Who are you afraid of?" The door opened before she could answer, and a man in an expensive grey suit strode in, his face carved from the same cold marble as every Conti Dante had ever met. "Get away from my wife," Marco Conti said. The word landed in Dante's chest like a blade twisting slow. Wife. He rose from the chair with the unhurried menace of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, and he let his eyes travel over Marco Conti with the flat, assessing contempt of a predator sizing up something that had wandered too close. He knew the name. Everyone in the Chicago underworld knew the name Conti, the family that had spent the last 2 decades locked in an uneasy, blood-soaked détente with the Morettis, a peace held together by nothing more than mutual exhaustion and the occasional arranged marriage meant to paper over old wounds. He hadn't known, until this exact second, that Elena Marchetti had become part of that architecture. "Marco," Dante said, and made the name sound like an insult. "I didn't realize the Contis had started marrying outside the family playbook, and I didn't realize the Morettis made a habit of hovering over unconscious women in hospital rooms," Marco snapped back, moving to Elena's bedside with the stiff, performative concern of a man executing a duty rather than feeling one. "Elena, baby, are you—" "I'm fine," Elena said quickly, too quickly, her eyes darting between the two men like she was calculating the blast radius of whatever was about to detonate. "Marco, Mr. Moretti's men found me after the clash. He's the reason I'm alive." Something flickered across Marco's face. Not gratitude, Dante noted, with the cold clarity of a man who'd spent his whole life reading micro-expressions for a living, but calculation, a recalibration of risk. "Then I owe you a debt," Marco said, extending a hand that Dante did not take. "But I'll take it from here. My family will handle her security." "Your family," Dante said softly. "Let a car run her off the road tonight and drive away without stopping." The room went silent in a way that had weight. "What are you talking about?" Marco's voice had lost its polish. "A black sedan clipped her car and forced her into the divider," Dante said. "Then it left. Didn't slow down, didn't call it in, didn't so much as glance back. That's not an accident, Conti. That's a message, and I'd very much like to know who it was addressed to." He watched Marco's face for the flicker of guilt, the microsecond of recognition that would tell him whether the man standing across from him already knew the answer. What he saw instead was genuine, unguarded alarm, quickly smothered, but real. "I don't know anything about that," Marco said. "Then find out," Dante said, "because until you do, my men are staying on that door." He nodded toward the hallway, where 2 of his soldiers stood in dark suits like sentinels carved from granite. "Call it a professional courtesy between families, or call it whatever helps you sleep tonight." Marco's jaw tightened, weighing the wisdom of arguing with a man whose organization could erase the Conti family's shipping routes with 3 phone calls. He chose silence, which was, Dante thought, the first intelligent decision the man had made since walking into the room. "Elena," Marco said instead, turning back to her, his hand settling briefly, almost obligatorily, over hers. "I have to make some calls. I'll be right outside." The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the temperature of the room changed entirely. Eleanor exhaled a breath that seemed to have been trapped in her chest for the entire exchange, her shoulders sagging against the pillows. And when she looked at Dante again, the fear in her eyes had shifted into something rawer, something closer to grief. "You shouldn't provoke him," she said quietly. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand exactly what men like that are capable of," Dante said, sitting again, closer this time, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. I've built an empire around understanding it. What I don't understand, Eleanor, is how you ended up married to one of them. Her hand curled protectively over her stomach again, an unconscious gesture he was beginning to recognize as pure instinct, the same way some men reached for a weapon when they felt cornered. 10 years is a long time, she said. People do what they have to do to survive. 10 years, Dante repeated, and something dangerous crept into his voice, low and quiet, and far more frightening than shouting would have been. You disappeared without a word, no note, no goodbye. I spent 2 years tearing this city apart looking for you, Eleanor. I need you to understand that, before you tell me people do what they have to do. Tears welled in her eyes again, and this time she didn't try to hide them. You don't know what happened, she whispered. You don't know what my father did.
What your father did?
Dante went very still. My father. Ask him, she said, her voice breaking. Ask Vittorio Moretti why I left, Dante. Ask him what he told my father the night before I disappeared, and then decide if you still want to sit at my bedside, pretending you're the wounded party in all of this. The monitor beeped on, indifferent, while 10 years of grief cracked open between them like a fault line finally giving way. Dante didn't sleep that night. He left the hospital only after Elena had drifted into exhausted, medicated sleep, and he drove, not home, not to any of his 6 safe houses scattered across the city, but to the mausoleum quiet study of the Moretti family estate, where his father's ghost still lived in every dark wood shelf and every framed photograph of men who had died for this family's ambitions. Vittorio Moretti had been dead for 4 years, killed not by a rival's bullet, but by the slow, unglamorous betrayal of his own liver, and Dante had inherited an empire built on secrets he was still, apparently, uncovering one at a time. He sat behind his father's old desk and pulled the second drawer completely out of its frame, the way Vittorio had once shown him when Dante was 16 and desperate to understand the architecture of power he'd been born into. Beneath the false bottom, ledgers, names, debts collected in blood and silence going back 3 decades. It took him 40 minutes to find the entry. S. Marchetti, outstanding debt, $340,000, gambling losses via the Cicero operation. Settlement negotiated, daughter's marriage to secure Conti peace treaty, effective immediately. M. terminated, relocated. No further contact permitted. The date was 10 years and 3 weeks old. Dante read it 4 times before the words fully assembled themselves into meaning. And when they finally did, something in his chest went cold and then very, very hot. Salvatore Marchetti, Elena's father, had owed Vittorio's crew a fortune he could never repay. And Vittorio, ever the pragmatist, ever the man who saw every human relationship as a lever to be pulled, had used that debt to broker a peace with the Contis that Dante had spent years believing was the product of careful diplomacy. He had been proud of that peace. He had built policy on top of it. He had never once imagined it had been purchased with the girl he loved. M. terminated. Relocated. Terminated. Like she was an account to be closed, like 10 years of Dante's grief had been a footnote in his father's ledger, an acceptable casualty in a transaction Vittorio hadn't bothered to mention to his own son. He thought of every conversation he'd had with his father in the 2 years he'd spent searching for Eleanor, the 2 years he'd hired investigators, called in favors across 3 states, driven himself half mad, wondering if she was dead in a ditch somewhere or simply didn't want to be found. He remembered Vittorio's hand on his shoulder, the practiced sympathy in his voice. "Some women aren't built for this life, son. Let her go. You'll thank me one day." His own father had orchestrated her disappearance and then consoled him for the loss, like it was an act of God, rather than an act of cruelty with his signature on it. Dante's hand closed around the ledger, hard enough to crease the leather. He thought of Elena's face in that hospital bed, the fear that lived behind her eyes whenever Marco Conti was in the room, the way she'd flinched at Dante's presence, like a woman bracing for a debt to come due all over again. 10 years she'd carried this. 10 years she'd believed... What? That Dante had known? That he'd let her go willingly? That he simply hadn't cared enough to look? The betrayal cut in 2 directions at once, and he wasn't sure which wound bled worse. The one his father had carved into his own life, or the one Elena must have believed about him for a decade. He picked up his phone and called Nico. "I need everything on Salvatore Marchetti," he said. "Where he lives now, what he's doing, whether he's still breathing. And I need the full file on the Moretti-Conti peace agreement from 10 years ago. Every signature, every witness, every dollar that moved." "On it," Nico said. "Boss, should I ask what this is about?" "No," Dante said. "You shouldn't." He hung up and sat alone in the dark study for a long time, the ledger open before him, like a confession his father had never had the courage to give in life. And for the first time in 10 years, Dante Moretti allowed himself to feel the full, unrestrained shape of his own grief. Not the practiced, disciplined mourning of a man who buried his losses beneath work, but the raw, furious ache of a 22-year-old boy who had lost the only good thing he'd ever had and hadn't even been given the truth of why. Somewhere across the city, in a hospital bed with 2 of his soldiers standing guard outside her door, Elena Marchetti, Elena Conti now, a name that tasted like ash in his mouth, was carrying a child that was not his, married to a man he was quickly coming to despise, and haunted by a betrayal Dante had only just learned belonged to his own bloodline. He didn't know yet how much more there was to uncover. He only knew that, whatever it cost him, he was done letting the Moretti and Conti families decide the shape of Elena's life without her. Nico called at 6 in the morning with a name. "The sedan was registered to a shell company," he said, "dead end on paper, but we pulled traffic cam footage from 4 blocks out. Boss, the driver peeled off toward the Conti warehouse district on Racine. Whoever did this either works for the Contis or wanted it to look that way." Dante stood at the window of his penthouse, the city grey and rain-slicked below him, and turned the information over like a blade in his palm. "Which do you think it is?" "Honestly? Could go either way. Enzo Conti's been agitating for a bigger cut of the western routes for 2 years. Man's ambitious in a way that makes his own family nervous." Enzo Conti, Marco's uncle, the family's underboss, a man Dante had crossed paths with exactly 3 times in a decade and disliked intensely each time. Not because Enzo was dangerous in the obvious way of men who enjoyed violence, but because he was patient in the way of men who understood that patience was simply violence with better manners. "Keep digging," Dante said. "Quietly. I don't want Marco Conti to know we're looking at his own uncle before we're certain. And the girl? Dante's jaw tightened at the word girl, though he knew Nico meant nothing by it. She's not just a girl, Nico. She's the reason I spent 2 years of my life chasing ghosts. Post 2 more men at the hospital. I want eyes on anyone who visits her room besides Conti. He arrived at the hospital by 7, coffee in hand, though he had no intention of drinking it, and found Elena awake, sitting up against a mountain of pillows, picking at a hospital breakfast tray with the distracted air of a woman whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Marco was nowhere in sight. "You look tired," she said when he walked in, and something in her voice, a flicker of the old gentleness, the version of her that used to worry over him when he came home bruised from his father's business, nearly undid him. "I found something last night," Dante said, pulling the chair close again. "About my father. About the peace agreement." Elena went very still, her fork suspended over a tray of unappetizing eggs. "Dante, I read the ledger, Elena. I know about the debt. I know what he did to your father, and I know what it cost you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, forcing himself to hold her gaze, even though every part of him wanted to look away from what he knew he'd see there. "I need you to know I didn't. I swear to you, on my life, on everything I have left of honor in this business, I didn't know. I looked for you for 2 years believing you'd left me, believing I'd done something or wasn't enough or stop." A voice cracked. "Please, stop." He stopped. Tears slid silently down her face, and she made no move to wipe them away, just let them fall, like she'd given up the fight to appear composed the moment he'd said the word ledger. "I believed you knew," she said finally. "For 10 years, Dante, I believed you let it happen. My father came to me the night before I disappeared and told me Vittorio Moretti had arranged everything, that you'd agreed it was for the best, that a Marchetti girl with a gambling debt hanging over her family had no business in a Moretti son's life. He said you'd already moved on. He said," her voice broke entirely, "he said you told him yourself that you didn't want complications." Dante's hands curled into fists on his knees, rage building in his chest with nowhere to go, a decade too late to be aimed at the man who deserved it most. "He lied to you," Dante said, low and furious. "My father lied to both of us. He erased you from my life and then spent 2 years watching me tear myself apart looking for you. And he let me believe it was your choice. He let you believe it was mine." "Why would he do that?" Elena whispered. "Why go to that much trouble?" "Because peace with the Contis was worth more to him than his own son's happiness," Dante said. "Because that's what this life does to people, Elena. It converts everything, love, grief, loyalty, into currency. You were the price he paid for a treaty. I was collateral damage he decided not to mention." She was quiet for a long moment, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach in that same unconscious, protective gesture. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Something in her tone made the hair rise on the back of Dante's neck. Not fear this time, but the particular gravity of a woman about to detonate something she'd been carrying alone for a very long time. "Okay," he said carefully. "I'm listening." Eleanor closed her eyes, drew a breath that shook on the way in, and said, "This baby isn't Marco's." The words hit the room like a gunshot, and for several long seconds, Dante Moretti, a man who had built an empire on never once showing surprise, simply forgot how to breathe. "Explain," Dante said, when he finally found his voice again. It came out rougher than he intended, a low rasp scraped raw by shock. Elena's hands trembled against the blanket. 8 months ago, before any of this, before I even knew I was pregnant, my father brought me back to Chicago. He'd fallen ill, and I came to see him, thinking it would be a quiet visit, in and out in a week. There was a charity gala the Contis were hosting. My father insisted I attend, some old debt of loyalty I didn't fully understand at the time. I didn't want to go. I hadn't set foot in this city in 9 years. Dante's chest tightened, already sensing where this was heading, memory clawing its way to the surface. A gala 8 months ago, black tie, a ballroom full of men he despised, wearing smiles they didn't mean. And across the room, impossibly, a woman in green, who had turned when he said her name, like she'd been waiting a decade to hear it. "You were there," he said. "I remember." "I saw you," Elena whispered, and it was like no time had passed at all, like 10 years just folded in on themselves. I told myself I would say hello, be polite, leave early. I didn't plan for anything else to happen. "Neither did I," Dante said, and the memory rose, fully formed now, sharp and aching, the two of them slipping out onto a private terrace overlooking the lake, the cold air and the noise of the party fading behind glass doors, her laugh startled out of her at something he'd said, the first unguarded sound he'd heard from her in a decade. He remembered the way she'd looked at him, like he was something she'd mourned and never expected to see resurrected. He remembered not being able to stop himself from closing the distance between them. "We talked for hours," Elena said, "about everything, about nothing. I told myself it was just grief, just closure. Just two people saying goodbye properly this time, instead of the way we'd been forced to before. And then you came back to my penthouse," Dante finished quietly, "and we said goodbye in a way that wasn't goodbye at all." Colour rose in Elena's cheeks even now, even 10 weeks from delivering a child, even lying in a hospital bed with a fractured rib and a husband down the hall. "I told myself it was one night, a mistake born out of 10 years of grief we'd never gotten to properly finish. I flew back to New York 3 days later. I didn't even know I was late until 6 weeks after that." "And Marco?" Dante's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "My father arranged the marriage almost as soon as I got back from Chicago, before I even knew about the baby," Elena said. "The debt situation had worsened. He owed the Contis money too, this time on top of what he owed your father's organization years before. Marco needed a wife to satisfy an old obligation his own father made before he died, some agreement about uniting the families more permanently. I was already the currency once, Dante. I didn't have the strength to fight it a second time, not with a baby I hadn't told anyone about yet." "Does he know?" Dante asked. "Does Marco know the child isn't his?" Elena hesitated, and in that hesitation, Dante saw an entire second story he hadn't yet been told. "Marco knows," she said carefully, "because our marriage was never... because Marco doesn't..." She stopped, seeming to search for words that wouldn't betray a confidence that wasn't only hers to give. Marco married me to satisfy his family's demands, not because he wanted a wife. There are things about Marco his family would kill to keep quiet, and a convenient marriage protects him as much as it was supposed to protect me. He's been kind, kinder than I expected, but there's never been anything between us, Dante. Not before the wedding, not after. Dante sat back, the pieces of the last 24 hours rearranging themselves into a shape he hadn't been prepared for. Marco Conti, married in name only, harbouring some secret his family would destroy him for. Elena, pregnant with Dante's child, trapped inside a marriage built on two separate, desperate lies. And somewhere in the underworld, beneath both their families, a black sedan that had run her off the road with lethal precision, as if someone already suspected the truth and wanted the problem to disappear before it could be born. "The baby is mine," Dante said, testing the words, feeling the full seismic weight of them settle into his bones. "Yes," Elena whispered. "I was going to tell you. I swear to you, Dante, I was building up the courage to find you, to tell you everything, before the accident happened. I didn't want you to find out like this." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "You're not doing any of this alone anymore," Dante said, his voice low, final, the voice he used when he made vows he intended to keep with his life if necessary. "Not the pregnancy, not the Contis, not whoever ran you off that road last night. I lost you once because I didn't know what was happening in time to stop it. That will not happen again." Outside the hospital room door, unheard by either of them, a nurse who had been paid a great deal of money by Enzo Conti's people finished jotting notes on a clipboard and slipped quietly down the hallway to make a phone call. Enzo Conti received the call in his study, a room panelled in dark walnut and lit by a single green banker's lamp, the kind of room built to make visitors feel small. "She told him," the nurse's voice said through the phone, tight with the particular fear reserved for people who dealt with dangerous men for money. "I heard it through the door. The baby's not Marco's, it's Moretti's." Enzo said nothing for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "Are you certain?" he said finally. "That's the phrase she used. Moretti's." "Yes, sir." "Good," Enzo said. "Thank you. You'll find an additional payment in your account by morning." He hung up and sat alone with the information, turning it over with the meticulous patience that had kept him alive and powerful in an industry that chewed up impatient men and spat out their bones. He had suspected, of course, the moment he'd heard about the gala 8 months ago, the whispers of Elena Marchetti slipping away from the ballroom for the better part of an hour, with the Moretti heir trailing not far behind. He had filed it away, the way he filed away everything, a card to be played when the moment was right. The moment, it seemed, had arrived early, and considerably more explosively than he'd anticipated. A child, Moretti's child, carried by the woman his nephew had married to secure the family's future, growing inside her at this very moment, in a hospital bed, 2 of Dante Moretti's own soldiers were guarding like sentries. Enzo had ordered the car that ran Elena off the road, a preliminary move, a warning meant to remind Salvatore Marchetti's family that debts were never truly settled, that the Contis expected the loyalty they'd purchased to be delivered in full and on schedule. He hadn't known about the pregnancy at the time. He certainly hadn't known whose child it was. Had he known, he might have simply ordered it finished the first time. He wouldn't make that mistake twice. The problem, as Enzo saw it, was elegant in its danger. If word got out that Elena Conti was carrying Dante Moretti's child, it would humiliate Marco beyond recovery, shatter whatever fragile dignity the marriage had provided him, and, more importantly, hand Dante Moretti a claim of blood that could unravel the entire peace treaty the Contis had spent a decade building on the foundation of that marriage. Worse, if the child was a boy, he would be born with legitimate ties to both families, a living, breathing symbol of exactly the kind of merger Enzo had spent his career preventing, because a united Moretti-Conti bloodline meant there would be no room left in this city for an ambitious underboss with dreams of his own. He needed the problem to disappear before it could draw its first breath. He picked up his phone and dialed a different number. Not the disposable one he'd used to hire the driver of the black sedan, but a private line reserved for a very specific kind of specialist. "I need something arranged," Enzo said when the call connected, discreetly. "A woman, currently at Northwestern Memorial, 34 weeks pregnant. I want it to look like a complication. Natural causes, no connection back to this family." There was a pause on the other end. "That's a hospital under heavy security right now. Moretti's men are on the door." "Then you'll need to be patient and creative," Enzo said, unbothered. "I don't pay you for easy jobs, I pay you for impossible ones." He hung up and poured himself another 2 fingers of whiskey, looking out over the dark garden behind his estate, where a fountain his late brother had installed 30 years ago still ran, indifferent to every scheme that had been plotted beneath its sound. Marco would be devastated, of course, when the truth eventually surfaced, if it surfaced at all, which Enzo intended to prevent. But Marco had never been built for this life the way Enzo had. Marco was soft in ways their family had tried and failed to correct since childhood, distracted by things a Conti heir had no business being distracted by, grateful for a marriage of convenience that let him disappear into his private life while his uncle handled the actual business of power. Enzo had built this family's current strength on 20 years of decisions Marco would never have the stomach to make. He wasn't about to let a Moretti bastard, born from one desperate reunion at a charity gala, undo 2 decades of careful architecture. He would handle Elena the way he handled every threat, quietly, efficiently, and with enough distance that his own hands would never carry the blood. What he did not yet know, what would prove in the coming days to be the single greatest miscalculation of his career, was that Dante Moretti had already assigned 3 separate teams to monitor every person who entered or exited Elena's hospital floor, cross-referencing hospital staff against known associates of both families with an obsessive, methodical fury that made his soldiers whisper behind his back that the boss hadn't looked at a woman like that in the 10 years they'd known him. Enzo Conti was patient, but Dante Moretti was already 3 moves ahead of him, and he hadn't even realized the game had started. The nurse who had sold information to Enzo Conti did not return to work the following morning. Instead, a woman Dante's people had never seen before appeared on the maternity wing at 4 in the morning, dressed in scrubs, badge clipped neatly to her chest, carrying a tray of medication with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged there. She almost made it to Elena's door. "Can I help you?" one of Dante's men said, stepping into her path with the easy, deceptively casual posture of someone who had learned that violence announced too early lost its advantage. Medication rounds, the woman said, holding up the tray. Room 412. Funny, the guard said. Hospital staff badge that one for the night shift got fired 2 days ago. You'll have to forgive us for being careful about who we let near this door. Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes did. The flat, calculating shift of a professional recognizing that the job had gone wrong. She turned to leave with unhurried steps, and it was only when she reached the stairwell that she broke into a sprint, and by then Dante's men were already moving. They caught her 3 floors down in a maintenance corridor that smelled of bleach and old pipes, and when they searched the tray she'd dropped in her flight, they found a syringe of concentrated potassium chloride hidden beneath a stack of ordinary medication cups, enough to stop a heart within minutes and leave behind almost nothing a routine autopsy would flag as suspicious. Dante arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later, having been woken by Nico's call, and stood in a locked security office, staring down at the woman who sat, silent and unbothered, in a folding chair with her wrists zip-tied behind her back. "Who sent you?" Dante said. It wasn't a question. It was a demand delivered in the tone of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end, regardless of the answer he received. The woman said nothing. "You understand," Dante said, crouching so he was eye level with her, "that whoever hired you has already decided you're expendable. The moment this job failed, you became a liability. They'll come for you before the police even finish processing the paperwork, assuming the police get involved at all." He let that settle. "I can offer you something they can't. Protection, money, a new city, a new name, a life that isn't a countdown to your own execution. All I need is a name." For a long moment, the woman simply stared at him, weighing, in the particular arithmetic of professionals who'd made a career out of trusting no one, whether the offer was real. "Enzo Conti," she said finally, quiet, resigned. "I don't know anything else. I was hired through an intermediary, paid through an account that'll be closed by morning. He wanted it to look natural, a complication from the pregnancy." Dante's blood went cold, then hot, in the space of a single heartbeat. Enzo Conti, Marco's uncle, the Conti underboss. Not a rival family, not a mysterious third party, but the very family Elena had been married into for protection, sending a killer into her hospital room to end her life, and with it, the life of Dante's unborn child. He rose, his jaw set in a hard line, and turned to Nico. "Get her somewhere safe. Do exactly what I said. New city, new name, whatever it takes to keep her breathing and keep her mouth shut for now. I want this handled quietly until I decide how loudly I intend to respond." Then he walked to Elena's room, where 2 more of his men now stood on either side of the door, with their hands resting, visibly, on the weapons beneath their jackets, and found her awake, alerted by the commotion, her face pale, with a fear that had nothing to do with the accident anymore. "What happened?" she said the moment he walked in. "Dante, what's going on? Tell me." "Enzo Conti, they're to have you killed tonight," Dante said. There was no gentle way to deliver it, and he'd never believed in softening truths that people needed in order to survive. "Disguised as a nurse, my men caught her 3 floors down." Elena's hand flew to her stomach, her breath coming fast and shallow, panic rising visibly in her chest. "Marco's uncle. He knows. He already knows about the baby." "He knows," Dante confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking both her hands in his, grounding her the way he used to when they were young and the world felt too large and too dangerous for either of them to survive alone. Which means you cannot stay in this hospital, and you cannot go back to any property connected to the Conti family.
Elena, look at me.
She looked at him, eyes wide and glassy with terror. "You're coming with me," Dante said. "Tonight. My penthouse has more security than this entire hospital, and no Conti soldier will get within a mile of the building without me knowing about it first. I'm not asking you, Elena. I'm telling you, because I already buried you once in my heart 10 years ago, and I refuse to do it again in reality." For the first time since the crash, Elena didn't argue. She simply nodded, tears sliding silently down her face, and let Dante Moretti gather her carefully into his arms, IV line and all, ready to carry her, and the child growing beneath her heart, his child, the one piece of the last decade that had somehow, impossibly, survived intact, out of the reach of a man who had just declared war without knowing his enemy was already 3 steps ahead. The Moretti penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a tower overlooking the lake, a fortress disguised as luxury, with reinforced glass, biometric locks, and a private elevator that required a key Dante had personally handed to fewer than 6 people in his life. Elena had never seen it before. 10 years ago, Dante had lived in a modest apartment above one of his father's restaurants, still years from inheriting the empire that would eventually build him a home like this. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, standing in the vast living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the dark expanse of Lake Michigan, though her voice carried more exhaustion than admiration. Discharge papers and doctor's orders for bed rest were folded in Dante's jacket pocket. The accident, combined with the stress of the last 24 hours, had left her fragile in a way that made his chest ache every time he looked at her. "The bedroom's this way," Dante said, guiding her gently down the hall, one hand hovering at the small of her back, like he was afraid she might shatter if he wasn't careful. "You'll have the whole east wing to yourself. There's a private bathroom, a reading room, anything you need." "You don't have to do all this," Elena said, though the words lacked conviction, exhaustion softening whatever pride might have made her argue harder. "I do," Dante said simply, and left it there, because the alternative, trying to explain the full weight of 10 years of grief compressed into 24 hours of terror and revelation, felt like more than either of them had the strength for tonight. He settled her into the bedroom, adjusted the pillows so she could recline without straining her fractured ribs, and stood at the doorway a moment longer than necessary, unable to quite make himself leave. "Dante," she said, catching him before he turned away. "Thank you. For everything. For not hating me when I told you about the baby. I was so afraid you'd think I trapped you, or lied to you, or—" "Elena." He came back into the room, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "I have spent 10 years grieving a version of you I invented because I didn't have the truth. I would rather have this, the accident, the danger, Enzo Conti, all of it, than another 10 years of that particular kind of nothing." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it, let her thread her fingers through his the way she used to when they were young enough to believe love could simply outrun the world they'd both been born into. "I'm scared," she admitted, in a voice smaller than he'd heard from her since he'd pulled her from the wreckage. "Not just of Enzo, of what happens after, to us, to this baby. I don't know how to be the woman who blows up two mafia families' peace treaty, Dante. I never wanted to be at the center of a war. You're not going to be at the center of a war, Dante said, though even as he said it, he understood the promise might be beyond his control to keep. I'm going to handle Enzo Conti, quietly if I can, permanently if I must. And Marco already knows, Eleanor said. He's known since I told him 3 weeks ago, when I finally worked up the courage. He didn't react the way you'd expect. Dante's brow furrowed. How did he react? Eleanor hesitated, and Dante recognized again the particular quality of a secret that belonged to someone else. He was relieved, she said finally. Marco never wanted this marriage any more than I did, Dante. There's someone else he loves, a man his family would disown him for, maybe worse. Our marriage gave him cover. A wife on paper meant his family stopped asking questions about why he never brought anyone home. When I told him about the baby, he actually laughed, said it solved a problem he'd been dreading, an heir eventually expected of him that he'd never have to actually father himself. The revelation rearranged something in Dante's understanding of the last 2 days. Marco Conti, not a villain, not even really an adversary, but another casualty of the same machinery that had stolen a decade from Dante and Elena both. A man trapped in his own gilded cage, grateful for a marriage that let him hide, now caught between his uncle's ambition and a truth that could destroy them both. He won't stand in our way, Elena said, but Dante, his uncle, will. Enzo doesn't care about Marco's happiness or mine. He cares about power, and a Moretti-Conti child is a threat to everything he's built. Then we make sure Enzo Conti never gets close enough to be a threat again, Dante said. And there was something in his voice now, quiet, absolute, the sound of a man who had already begun assembling the machinery of retribution in his mind. Rest, Eleanor. Tonight, you don't have to be afraid of anything. I promise you that much. He stayed until her breathing evened into sleep, her hand still loosely wrapped around his, and for a long time after, Dante Moretti sat in the dark beside the first woman he had ever loved, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing, feeling the ghost of a decade-old promise settle back into his bones like something that had simply been waiting all this time for the chance to be kept. Morning light spilled across the penthouse in pale gold, and Dante found Elena already awake when he brought coffee, decaf for her, at Whitfield's insistence, to the small breakfast nook overlooking the lake. "You didn't sleep," she said, studying the shadows beneath his eyes. "I don't sleep much these days," Dante admitted, setting the cup in front of her. "Occupational hazard." She wrapped both hands around the mug, the morning light catching the faint silver scar at her hairline from the crash, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised them both after everything the last 2 days had unearthed. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said finally. "Anything. Did you ever get married? In 10 years, did you ever?" She stopped, seeming to lose her nerve part-way through the question, but Dante understood exactly what she was asking. "No," he said simply. "I dated, occasionally. Nothing that lasted more than a few months. My father used to say I was married to the business instead, and for a long time I let myself believe that was the reason. It wasn't until I saw you again at that gala that I understood I'd simply been comparing every woman I met to a ghost, and none of them ever measured up, because the ghost wasn't fair competition. She was real once, and I never stopped being in love with her." Elena's eyes glistened, and she looked down at her coffee to hide it. "I thought about you every single day," she confessed. Even when I hated you, even when I believed you'd let me go without a fight, I thought about you. I used to see men your height in crowds, and my whole chest would seize up before I remembered you weren't supposed to be there. Elena, I need to tell you something else, she said, straightening, gathering the particular courage of someone about to hand over a piece of themselves they'd protected fiercely. About my father, about why he really let Vittorio's deal happen. Dante sat back, giving her the space to continue. My father wasn't just in debt, Elena said. He was terrified. Not of Vittorio, of what Vittorio's men would do to my mother, who was already sick by then, if he didn't cooperate. Vittorio didn't just offer him a way out of the debt, Dante. He threatened her. Told my father that if I didn't disappear quietly and marry into whatever arrangement he negotiated down the line, my mother wouldn't survive the year, one way or another. Dante's jaw tightened, fury rekindling for a man 4 years in the ground, a father whose cruelty apparently had no flaw. She died anyway, Elena said quietly, 8 months after I left. Cancer, not violence, but by then it didn't matter. My father spent the following decade convinced he'd sacrificed his only daughter for nothing, that the cruelty had been for its own sake, a demonstration of power more than a real transaction. He carries that guilt every day. It's part of why he insisted I come back for the gala 8 months ago, some desperate hope that seeing you again might undo some fraction of what he believed he'd broken. He should have told me, Dante said. He should have come to me directly, instead of letting my father run the whole operation unchallenged. Would you have believed him? Eleanor asked. 10 years ago, would 22-year-old Dante Moretti have believed his own father was capable of threatening a sick woman to force a marriage over a man who'd raised him, taught him everything he knew? Dante didn't answer, because the honest answer was no, and they both knew it. We were young, Eleanor said, softer now. We were young, and our families were monsters long before either of us understood the shape of the world we'd been born into. I don't blame you anymore, Dante. I spent a long time blaming you, and I was wrong to. But I need you to understand. I can't go back to being naive about what this life costs people. Not with a baby coming. Not after what almost happened at the hospital. I understand, Dante said, and meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in the last decade. Which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually consider it before you answer, instead of reacting out of fear. Elena went still. What? Marry me, Dante said. The words hung in the golden morning light between them, enormous and inevitable, 10 years overdue. Not because of the baby, he continued quickly, before she could speak, not because it would be convenient, or because it would solve a political problem with the Contis, though God knows it would complicate things for Enzo considerably. Marry me, because I have loved you since I was 20 years old, Elena, and I have spent a decade discovering that nothing, not power, not money, not building the most feared organization in this city, has ever come close to filling the space you left behind. I don't want to waste another single day pretending otherwise. Elena's hands trembled around her coffee cup, tears sliding freely down her face now, and for a long, breathless moment she said nothing at all. Dante. Elena set the coffee cup down, her hands still shaking, and reached for both of his instead, holding them like an anchor. I love you. I never stopped, not for one single day of these 10 years, even when I hated you for a lie that wasn't yours. but I can't say yes. Not yet. Something in his chest tightened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, the discipline of a man who had learned long ago never to let his face betray the true depth of a wound. "Tell me why," he said. "Because I'm still legally married to Marco Conti," Elena said. "Because Enzo Conti just tried to have me killed, and if we announce an engagement before that threat is dealt with, we hand him a reason to escalate that's even more urgent than the one he already has. Because I want to marry you, Dante, when it's a choice made out of love and safety, not out of fear and desperation dressed up as romance. I don't want our wedding to be a strategic countermove in a mafia war. I want it to be ours." Dante studied her for a long moment, and the ache in his chest slowly reshaped itself into something that looked almost like relief, because the woman in front of him, careful, clear-eyed, unwilling to let even the deepest love override good judgment, was exactly the woman he remembered from 10 years ago, the one who'd once talked him out of a reckless confrontation with a rival family by simply asking him to consider the cost to the people who loved him. "Okay," he said, "then we deal with Marco. We deal with Enzo. And when it's safe, when you're not choosing me out of fear, when this baby is born into a world that isn't actively trying to kill his mother, I'll ask you again." "You'll ask me again," Eleanor repeated, a small, watery laugh escaping her. "Very confident, Mr.
Moretti.
"I've waited 10 years, Dante said. "I can wait a little longer, as long as I know the waiting has an end." She leaned into him then, resting her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm carefully around her, mindful of her ribs, and for a long moment they simply sat together in the golden morning light, two people who had lost each other through no fault of their own, finally allowing themselves to imagine a future neither of them had believed they'd get to keep. The moment was broken by Dante's phone buzzing against the table. He glanced at the screen. Nico, and answered immediately. "Talk to me." "Boss, Marco Conti's outside the building," Nico said. "Alone, no security detail, which either means he's an idiot or he's telling the truth that he came to talk, not fight."
He's asking to see Elena.
Dante looked at Elena, who had gone very still beside him, clearly having heard enough of the call to understand what was happening. "Let him up," Dante said. "But he comes through security first, and I want 2 men in the room the entire time." 20 minutes later, Marco Conti stood in the penthouse living room, looking smaller and more uncertain than he had in the hospital, his expensive suit slightly rumpled, dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting he too hadn't slept. "Elena," he said, and then, glancing at Dante, added, "Moretti, I need to talk to both of you." "Talk," Dante said, arms crossed, standing close enough to Elena that the message was unmistakable. "My uncle tried to have you killed," Marco said, looking at Elena, his voice raw with something that sounded almost like shame.
"I found out an hour ago. One of his men got drunk and bragged about it to the wrong person, and it got back to me. I want you to know I had no part in it. I would never." He stopped, visibly working to steady himself. "I know I haven't been the husband you deserved. I know this marriage has been a cage for both of us, but I would never let anyone hurt you or that baby. I need you to believe that." "I believe you," Elena said quietly, and Dante watched something in Marco's shoulders loosen at the words, the desperate relief of a man who had spent his entire life failing to be believed by the people whose approval mattered to his family. "I'm going to give you a divorce," Marco continued, Quietly, quickly. Whatever paperwork needs to happen, I'll sign it today. My family will be furious, but that's a problem I'll handle. What matters more right now is Enzo. He's not going to stop just because I object, Eleanor. He's spent 20 years building his position in this family, and he's not going to let a Moretti child undo it without a fight. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance, Dante said. Marco looked between them, the woman he'd never truly been married to, and the man who so clearly, visibly loved her. And for the first time since Dante had met him, something like genuine respect crossed his face. "There's something else you should know," Marco said. "Something about my uncle you'll need if you want to stop him for good." 15 years ago, Marco said, settling stiffly into a chair he hadn't been offered, though no one objected, "my uncle killed my father." The room went very quiet. "Everyone believes it was a rival hit," Marco continued, his voice steady in the practiced way of a man who had rehearsed this confession alone for years before ever intending to speak it aloud. "A Moretti retaliation for a shipment my father intercepted. That's the story that's been told for 15 years, and it's the story that put Enzo in position to become underboss, then de facto head of the family, once I proved too young and too unsuitable to take real control." "How do you know it wasn't a rival hit?" Dante asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because I found the ledger 3 years ago," Marco said. "Enzo kept records, meticulous ones. Men like him always do. They can't help themselves. They need to track every debt they've ever collected or paid, even the ones that would hang them. I found a payment to the same crew that supposedly carried out the rival hit, dated 2 weeks before my father died. Enzo paid the men who killed his own brother." Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Even Dante, who had built a career on discovering exactly how far ambition could corrupt a man, felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Why haven't you exposed him?" Dante asked. "Because I was 17 when my father died," Marco said, "and by the time I found the ledger, Enzo had spent a decade consolidating power, buying loyalty, making himself essential to every part of the family's operations. If I'd accused him without proof stronger than a decade-old ledger entry, he would have had me killed within the week and called it a tragic accident, the same way he did my father. I've spent 3 years gathering evidence quietly, waiting for the right moment, the right leverage, the right allies." He looked at Dante. "I think that moment might finally be now." "You want an alliance?" Dante said slowly. "I want my family back," Marco said, and for the first time, genuine emotion cracked through his composure. "I want to stop pretending to be a Conti heir who cares about maintaining a peace built on my father's murder. I want Enzo gone, permanently, and I want to run this family the way my father actually intended, as an equal partner to the Morettis, not an enemy in a decade-long détente held together by fear and arranged marriages. If you help me end my uncle's reign, Moretti, I'll give you everything you need to bury him. The ledger, witnesses I've cultivated over 3 years, financial records that'll implicate him in 6 crimes even his own soldiers won't be able to overlook." Dante studied Marco for a long moment, weighing the offer against the well-earned paranoia of a man who had survived a decade in this business by assuming every alliance concealed a second, hidden knife. "Why now?" Dante asked. "Why not 3 years ago, when you first found the ledger?" "Because 3 years ago, I had no reason to believe I could survive the fallout," Marco said simply. "I had no allies, no protection, nothing but a piece of paper that would get me killed the moment Enzo learned I had it. Now I have a Moretti standing in my living room, in love with my wife, furious enough about an assassination attempt on her life to burn my family's whole operation to the ground if I ask him to. That's not a coincidence I intend to waste. It was, Dante thought, a brutally honest answer, and brutal honesty was rarer in this business than loyalty itself. "Bring me the ledger," Dante said. "Bring me the witnesses. If everything you've told me is true, I'll help you end Enzo Conti's reign permanently. And in exchange, I expect the Conti family to formally recognize this child." He glanced at Elena, at the curve of her stomach beneath her sweater. "Without contest, without scandal, and without any further attempts on either of their lives." "Agreed," Marco said, extending a hand that Dante this time shook. Elena watched the exchange with an expression Dante couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, or the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 10 years believing she had no allies left in either family, only to discover, in the space of 2 days, that the machinery of 2 mafia empires was quietly realigning itself around the protection of her and her unborn child. "There's one more thing," Marco said, rising to leave. "Enzo already knows the attempt on Elena's life failed. He'll assume, correctly, that we're on to him now. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast, before he decides that a second attempt needs to be far less subtle than a fake nurse with a syringe." Dante's jaw tightened, already calculating the shape of what came next. "Then we move tonight," he said. Nico spread the documents Marco had delivered across the penthouse's reinforced conference table. Financial records, the 15-year-old ledger entry, sworn statements from 2 soldiers who had quietly grown disillusioned with Enzo's leadership over the years and were willing, for the right price and the right protection, to testify to things they'd witnessed. "This is enough to bury him 3 times over," Nico said, flipping through a folder of banking records that traced, in exhaustive detail, the money Enzo had funneled through shell companies over the past decade. Payments to hitmen, bribes to city officials, a pattern of financial maneuvering that painted the picture of a man who had been quietly building a private empire beneath the cover of his official position. "It's not enough to bury him legally," Dante said. "Men like Enzo Conti don't answer to courts. He answers to the Commission, to the other families who need to believe the peace between us is stable enough to be worth preserving. We need this evidence to convince them that Enzo is the threat to that peace. Not me, not Marco, not the child growing in that woman's stomach that half of them will assume is some Moretti provocation the second the rumour spreads." "So we call a sit-down," Nico said. "We call a sit-down," Dante confirmed. "The commission convenes, we present the evidence, and Enzo Conti answers for 15 years of fratricide and attempted murder in front of every family whose respect he spent a decade cultivating. If it's done right, his own soldiers won't lift a finger to protect him once they understand what he actually did to get where he is." Elena, who had been listening from the doorway with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, looked between the 2 men with visible unease. "And if it's done wrong?" Dante turned to her, his expression softening only slightly. "Then it becomes exactly the kind of war you're afraid of, which is why we're not going to do it wrong." She crossed the room slowly, settling into a chair near the table, and studied the documents laid out before her with the sharp, assessing focus Dante remembered from 10 years ago,
The girl who used to help her father balance impossible books, who had a mind for numbers and patterns that most people underestimated because she wore it quietly. "This entry," she said, tapping a financial record near the bottom of one page, "the payment to the crew that supposedly carried out the rival hit on Marco's father, it's routed through the same shell account Enzo used to pay the woman who tried to kill me at the hospital. Same numbered account, just a different holding company on top of it." Dante leaned over her shoulder, and Nico did the same, both men going very still as they traced the connection she'd spotted. "She's right," Nico said slowly. "That's not just evidence of the original hit. That directly ties this week's assassination attempt to the same financial infrastructure Enzo's used for 15 years. This isn't circumstantial anymore. This is a documented pattern." "Good eye," Dante said quietly, and something in Elena's face flickered. Pride, maybe, or simple relief at being useful in a fight that had, until now, felt like something happening entirely around her, rather than something she had any power to affect. "I want to be in the room when you present this," Elena said. "Elena, I'm not asking permission, Dante." Her voice hardened, the same steel he'd seen flash behind her fear back in the hospital room, a reminder that the woman in front of him had survived 10 years of hardship he hadn't yet fully heard the story of. "This is my life Enzo Conti tried to end. My child. I want the commission to look at the woman he tried to have murdered and understand exactly what kind of man they've been letting run half the Conti family's operations for a decade. That carries weight your ledgers alone can't." Dante studied her for a long moment, the protective instinct in him warring with the part of him that had always respected her mind, her nerve, the particular courage she'd shown even at 19, when she used to argue with him about the ethics of an industry neither of them had chosen to be born into. "Okay," he said finally, "you'll be there, but you don't leave my side. And the moment I say it's time to go, we go. No arguments." "Agreed," Eleanor said, and for the first time since the crash, something like determination replaced the fear that had lived behind her eyes since he'd pulled her from the wreckage. Outside the penthouse windows, the city lights spread out beneath them like a field of scattered stars, indifferent to the war quietly assembling itself in boardrooms and back channels across its skyline. And somewhere, in that same darkness, Enzo Conti sat in his walnut-panelled study, unaware that the evidence of his 15-year deception was about to be laid bare in front of every family whose respect he had spent a decade cultivating. The commission would convene in 3 days. Dante intended to make sure Enzo never saw it coming. 2 nights before the commission was set to convene, Dante woke to the quiet chime of his phone at 3 a.m., a security alert, motion detected on the penthouse's private elevator shaft, a system that should have been impossible to trigger without his personal biometric key. He was out of bed and reaching for the weapon in his nightstand before he was fully conscious. Some animal instinct honed over a decade of living with targets on his back, overriding thought entirely. "Nico," he said into his phone, already moving down the hallway toward Elena's room. "Talk to me." "Elevator's been breached," Nico said, voice tight. "We've got 2 unknowns on the private shaft, boss. They shouldn't have been able to get past the lobby, let alone the..." The line cut out. Dante didn't wait to hear the rest. He shoved open the door to Elena's room, finding her already awake, sitting up in bed, alerted by some instinct of her own, hand pressed protectively over her stomach. "What's happening?" she said, fear naked in her voice. "Someone's in the building," Dante said, crossing to her side in 3 strides, pulling her up and out of bed with careful urgency. We're moving to the panic room. Now. He guided her down a hidden hallway behind the bookshelf in his study, a passage he'd had installed the year he took over the family and understood, fully, the particular vulnerability of living at the top of a building everyone knew belonged to him. The panic room beyond was reinforced with steel, stocked with supplies for 2 weeks, and equipped with a direct line to both the police and a private security firm that answered to no one but Dante himself. He sealed her inside with 2 of his most trusted men and a promise to return. And then he went to meet whatever had breached his sanctuary, with the particular calm of a man who had been raised from childhood to understand that fear was a luxury he could process later, once the immediate threat had been neutralized. He found Nico and 4 other soldiers in the main living room, weapons drawn, standing over 2 men in dark tactical gear, both already zip-tied and bleeding from a confrontation that had apparently been brief and decisive. They came in through a maintenance shaft we didn't know connected to the elevator system, Nico said, breathing hard. Professional, not Conti soldiers, freelancers by the look of their gear, but someone paid for very specific, very expensive access to this building's blueprints. Dante crouched in front of the conscious one, the same cold, assessing calm he'd used on the nurse in the hospital, settling over his features. Enzo Conti. The man said nothing, but something in his eyes confirmed it before his mouth ever could. "You should know," Dante said quietly, "that I already have enough evidence to end Enzo Conti's career, his freedom, and quite possibly his life in front of the entire commission in 2 days. Whatever he's paying you, it isn't enough to be on the losing side of that particular war. Give me a name, a location, anything useful, and I'll make sure you survive what's coming. Stay loyal to a dead man walking, and you'll go down with him." The man's jaw tightened, weighing the same brutal arithmetic the nurse had weighed days before, and finally he spoke. "He's not waiting for the commission," the man said. "He knows you're bringing evidence. He's planning to move tonight. Not against her." He nodded vaguely toward the hidden hallway where Elena had disappeared. "Against Marco. If Marco's dead before the sit-down, there's no witness to corroborate the ledger. No heir left to challenge Enzo's claim to full control of the family. He becomes the only Conti with a legitimate path to leadership, and the whole case against him falls apart, with no one left standing to make it." Dante's blood went cold. He was already moving before the man finished speaking, phone pressed to his ear, dialing Marco's number with hands that, for the first time in years, weren't entirely steady. "Marco," he said the second the call connected, relief flooding through him at the sound of a groggy, very much alive voice on the other end. "Where are you right now?" "Home?" Marco said, confused. "Why, what's—" "Get out," Dante said. "Now. Enzo's coming for you tonight, and I need you somewhere I can protect you before he gets there." The line went silent for one terrible second, and then Dante heard it, a distant crash, glass breaking, and Marco's voice, suddenly sharp with panic, saying, "Someone's already here." "Marco!" Dante shouted into the phone, already grabbing his jacket, already barking orders at Nico to bring the car around. "Marco, talk to me!" There was a scuffle on the other end, muffled voices, and then Marco's voice again, breathless, quieter. "I'm in the panic room off my study. Whoever's here, they're not being subtle about searching the house. Dante, if this is Enzo's men—" "It is," Dante said. "I'm 10 minutes out. Do not open that door for anyone but me. Do you understand?" "Not for your uncle,
Not for anyone claiming to be police. No one. Understood. The drive across the city took Dante 7 minutes instead of 10. Nico weaving through empty pre-dawn streets with a violence that would have terrified anyone who hadn't spent a decade in cars driven by men trained for exactly this kind of urgency. Dante's men arrived in a second vehicle behind them, 6 soldiers total, weapons already checked and ready by the time they reached the wrought iron gates of the Conti estate. The gates were already open, not breached, opened deliberately by someone with access. Enzo's inside soldiers let this happen, Dante said grimly, understanding immediately what the open gate meant. This isn't an external hit. He's using his own family's security to move against Marco. They found the house in chaos, furniture overturned, a shattered window in the study, and 2 of Marco's own household guards lying wounded but alive in the hallway, disarmed rather than killed, which told Dante everything he needed to know about the restraint being ordered from above. Enzo wanted this to look accidental, wanted Marco's death explainable, and killing loyal household staff in the process would complicate that particular fiction. Dante found the panic room exactly where Marco had said, tucked behind a false wall in the study, and pounded on the reinforced door with the flat of his palm. "Marco, it's Dante. Open the door." A pause. Then the heavy mechanism disengaged, and Marco emerged, pale but unharmed, a small pistol gripped in one white-knuckled hand. "They didn't find me," Marco said, voice shaking with the particular adrenaline crash of a man who had genuinely believed for several long minutes that he was about to die. "I heard them searching. I heard one of them say my uncle wanted it done before sunrise." "We need to move," Dante said, "now, before Enzo realizes this attempt failed and decides on something less subtle." They got Marco into the second vehicle, flanked by 4 of Dante's soldiers, and were halfway back to the penthouse when Nico's phone rang, a number Dante recognized immediately as belonging to one of the men he'd stationed outside the panic room where Elena was hidden. Nico's face went white as he listened. "What?" Dante said, already knowing in the pit of his stomach that the night's danger hadn't finished delivering its worst. "There's a fire," Nico said, "in the building. Maintenance shaft, same access point the first team used. It's contained to a lower floor, but boss, the panic room's ventilation runs through that same shaft. They're saying smoke starting to come through the vents." Dante didn't remember the drive back to the penthouse. He remembered Nico's voice saying something about fire crews and building evacuation, and he remembered his own voice, distant and strange to his own ears, giving orders he couldn't fully recall issuing. He remembered arriving to find the lobby full of flashing lights and displaced residents in bathrobes, and he remembered shoving past 2 firefighters who tried to stop him from entering a stairwell that reeked of smoke, because nothing in the world, not fire, not the entire Chicago Fire Department, not his own survival instincts, was going to keep him from reaching Elena. He found the panic room exactly as he'd left it hours earlier, smoke curling thin and acrid through the ventilation grate near the ceiling, and his 2 soldiers already working to force the reinforced door open from the outside using a portable hydraulic jack meant for exactly this kind of emergency. "She's coughing pretty bad in there," one soldier said, sweat beading on his forehead from both exertion and fear. "But she's conscious. Baby's moving, she says. We'll have this door open in 90 seconds. 90 seconds had never felt so long in Dante Moretti's entire life.
When the door finally gave way, he found Eleanor curled against the far wall, a wet cloth pressed over her mouth and nose, with the instinctive practicality of a woman determined to protect the child inside her, even while gasping for clean air herself. And the moment their eyes met through the haze of smoke, something in Dante's chest broke open entirely. Every wall he'd built over 10 years of disciplined, controlled grief collapsing at once. "I've got you," he said, gathering her carefully into his arms, ribs and all, carrying her out into clean air with a fury building in his chest that he knew with absolute certainty would not be satisfied until Enzo Conti had answered for every single second of terror he had inflicted on the woman Dante loved. They moved the commission meeting up by a day. Elena, treated overnight for smoke inhalation and cleared by Whitfield the following morning, with stern instructions about rest and stress that everyone in the room understood were, under the circumstances, functionally impossible to follow, insisted on attending anyway, and this time Dante didn't argue. The commission convened in a private hall on neutral ground, an old Italian social club on the north side that had hosted these particular gatherings for over 60 years, its walls lined with photographs of men long dead who had built the fragile architecture of peace that still, somehow, held the city's 5 families in an uneasy balance. 7 men sat at the head table, representing the major families, along with 2 lawyers whose entire careers existed to interpret the Commission's particular brand of underworld justice. Enzo Conti arrived flanked by 3 of his own soldiers, composed and unhurried, clearly still confident that whatever accusation was coming, he had the standing and the decades of careful reputation building to survive it. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Marco to stand. 15 years ago, Marco began, his voice steadier than Dante had ever heard it. My father was murdered. Everyone in this room was told it was a Moretti retaliation for an intercepted shipment. I believed that story myself for most of my life. Enzo's expression didn't change, but Dante, watching closely, saw his hand tighten fractionally around the arm of his chair. 3 years ago, I found evidence that tells a different story, Marco continued, and nodded to Nico, who began distributing copies of the financial ledger to each family head at the table. A payment, dated 2 weeks before my father's death, to the exact crew that carried out the hit, routed through an account controlled by my uncle, Enzo Conti. Murmurs rippled through the room, the particular low, dangerous sound of powerful men recalculating alliances in real time. This isn't the only payment from that account, Marco continued, and gestured again for Nico to distribute a second set of documents. 4 days ago, this same account paid a woman to enter Northwestern Memorial Hospital disguised as a nurse, with the intention of murdering my wife, Elena Conti, who was recovering there after a car accident my uncle also arranged. Enzo rose to his feet now, composure cracking for the first time. This is absurd. Fabricated evidence from a nephew who's always resented my role in this family. The nurse is alive, Dante said, his voice cutting cleanly through Enzo's protest. In protective custody, willing to testify under oath that she was hired through that account and given explicit instructions to make Elena Conti's death look like a pregnancy complication. He let that land, watching several of the family heads at the table shift in their seats, the particular discomfort of men who understood that an attack on a pregnant woman crossed lines even this brutal industry generally respected. There's also the matter of last night, when Enzo's own soldiers breached my building using blueprints only accessible to someone with significant resources, and Enzo's men attempted to set a fire that nearly killed Elena and the child she's carrying while trapped in a panic room. And this morning, Marco added, before the sun rose, my own uncle sent men into my home to kill me, specifically timed to prevent me from testifying at this very meeting. The room had gone entirely silent now. 7 powerful men, absorbing the full architecture of Enzo Conti's 15-year campaign of fratricide and attempted murder, laid bare in a single morning.
There's one more thing the Commission should know, Elena said, rising from her chair beside Dante, and every head in the room turned toward her, the pregnant woman at the center of this entire storm, speaking for the first time. The child I'm carrying is Dante Moretti's, not Marco Conti's. My marriage to Marco was arranged to satisfy an old debt, and it was never consummated, a fact Marco himself will confirm. Enzo Conti didn't attempt to kill me because I was carrying a threat to the Conti bloodline. He attempted to kill me because a Moretti-Conti child, born through genuine love rather than political arrangement, represented exactly the kind of unification between our families that would make his own ambitions for total control impossible. The revelation landed like a detonation, several of the family heads exchanging sharp, startled glances, whispered calculations already forming about what this meant for the balance of power in the city. Enzo Conti, the eldest man at the table said finally, his voice carrying the particular weight of 60 years spent adjudicating exactly this kind of underworld reckoning. You stand accused of murdering your own brother, attempting to murder your nephew, and attempting to murder a pregnant woman and her unborn child in order to protect a position you obtained through fratricide. Do you deny any of this? Enzo looked around the room, at the faces of men who had respected him for decades now, regarding him with the particular coldness reserved for those who had broken the industry's oldest, most sacred rule, that family, whatever else this business demanded, was never to be spent so cheaply. He said nothing. His silence was, in this room, the only confession that mattered. The silence stretched long enough that even Enzo's own soldiers, flanking him at the back of the hall, began shifting their weight, some ancient survival instinct recognizing that the ground beneath their loyalty had just shifted permanently. I built this family, Enzo said finally, his voice low, almost conversational, the mask of composure cracking into something colder and more honest underneath. My brother was weak, sentimental. He would have let the Morettis walk all over us for the sake of some outdated notion of honor. Everything I did to make this family stronger. You did it to make yourself powerful, Marco said, and there was no fear left in his voice now, only the particular clarity of a man who had spent 15 years afraid of exactly this confrontation, and found, now that it had finally arrived, that the fear had simply burned away. You killed your own brother, and let me grow up believing a lie about how he died. You've spent 15 years positioning yourself as the family's protector while quietly murdering anyone who threatened your control. That's not strength, uncle. That's cowardice wearing strength's clothing. The eldest man at the table raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. The Commission has heard enough, he said. Enzo Conti,
By the ancient rules that govern this body, a man who murders his own blood to seize power forfeits any claim to protection this commission would otherwise extend.
You are stripped of all rank, all standing, all claimed Conti family assets and territory, effective immediately. What happens to you beyond this room is a matter for the Conti family to determine according to their own justice. Enzo's face went the colour of old ash. "Marco," he said, turning to his nephew, some last desperate appeal flickering behind his eyes. "I raised you. After your father died, I made sure you had everything. You raised me in a house built on my father's murder," Marco said quietly. "Everything you gave me, you gave with blood money. I don't want any part of what you built, uncle. Not anymore." Two of Enzo's own soldiers, the men Marco had cultivated as witnesses over 3 careful years, stepped forward now, and the particular finality of the gesture made clear exactly what was about to happen. Enzo looked at them, at the men who had served him for a decade, and found no loyalty left in their expressions, only the grim resolve of soldiers who understood that their own survival now depended on distancing themselves as completely as possible from a man the entire underworld had just watched be stripped of every protection that had ever shielded him. He was led from the hall without another word, and Dante understood, watching him go, that whatever justice the Conti family administered in the following days would be swift, brutal, and entirely beyond the Commission's concern. The eldest man at the table turned his attention to Dante and Elena, and something almost gentle crossed his weathered face. "It's not often this body has cause to celebrate rather than merely adjudicate," he said. "A child born of both the Moretti and Conti bloodlines, born of genuine love rather than political calculation. That's a rarer gift in this life than any of us are accustomed to receiving. The Commission recognizes your child, Signora, as legitimate under the protection of both families and extends its blessing on whatever future the two of you choose to build." Eleanor's hand found Dante's, gripping tight, and when Dante looked down at her, he found tears sliding freely down her face. Not fear this time, not grief, but the particular, overwhelming relief of a woman who had spent 10 years believing she would never again feel safe in this city, discovering in a single transformative morning that safety had finally, impossibly, arrived. Marco approached them as the hall began to empty, extending a hand to Dante that carried none of the wary calculation of their first meeting. "Thank you," Marco said, "for believing me, for helping me end something I've been too afraid to end alone for 3 years. Thank you," Dante said, "for the courage to stand up in that room today. Not every man would have risked what you risked for the truth." Marco looked at Elena, something warm and genuinely fond crossing his face. "Take care of her, and that baby. I mean that as a friend now, not an obligation." "I intend to," Dante said, "for the rest of my life." Outside the social club, the city moved on around them, indifferent to the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside its walls. And for the first time since the accident nearly 2 weeks ago, Elena Marchetti walked into the sunlight beside Dante Moretti without a single soldier flanking them for protection, because for the first time in 10 years there was, finally, nothing left to fear. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange, unfamiliar gentleness neither of them had experienced in the whole of their adult lives. Enzo Conti's fate,
once handed over to his own family, resolved itself quietly and permanently within 4 days, and Dante made no inquiries into the specifics, understanding that some justice was better left undocumented. Marco assumed formal control of the Conti family with the full backing of the commission, and one of his first acts as boss was to formally dissolve the marriage that had bound him to Elena, replacing it with a quiet, generous settlement and a standing invitation to consider the Conti family an ally rather than an obligation for the rest of her life.
Salvatore Marchetti, Elena's father, arrived from New York the following week, older and greyer than Dante remembered, carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent a decade believing he'd sacrificed his daughter for nothing. Dante watched from a careful distance as Elena embraced her father in the penthouse's living room, both of them crying in the unguarded way people only allow themselves once the danger that necessitated their composure has finally passed. "I'm sorry," Salvatore said to Dante later, when Elena had gone to rest, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken guilt. "For what my debt cost both of you. If I had been stronger—" "You protected your wife," Dante said. "There's no version of that story where you're the villain, Salvatore. The villains were my father and Enzo Conti, men who understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. You did what any father would do to save the people he loved." Salvatore's eyes filled, and he gripped Dante's hand with the particular gratitude of a man who had spent 10 years believing forgiveness was a door permanently closed to him. Dante spent those weeks rebuilding too. Not just the physical security of his organization, which he restructured extensively in the aftermath of the breach that had nearly cost Elena and Marco their lives, but something quieter and more personal. A slow dismantling of the walls he'd built around his own heart in the 10 years since Elena's disappearance. He found himself, for the first time since he was 22, imagining a future that extended beyond the next shipment, the next negotiation, the next threat to be neutralized. A future with a nursery down the hall from his bedroom, with a woman who made even his fortress of a penthouse feel, for the first time, like an actual home. Elena's due date arrived on a bright October afternoon, 6 weeks after the commission meeting that had rewritten the balance of power in Chicago's underworld. And when her labor began, 3 weeks earlier than expected, though gentle and unhurried compared to the violence of the accident that had first brought them back together, Dante was the one who drove her to the hospital, his hands steady on the wheel in a way they hadn't been the night he'd carried her from the wreckage of her car. The labor lasted 11 hours. Dante stayed by her side for every one of them, holding her hand through contractions, murmuring the same low, steady reassurances she'd once murmured to him during the terrifying early years of his father's business, back when he'd been young enough to still be afraid of the life he was inheriting. When the baby finally arrived, a girl, small and furious and perfect, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced her displeasure at the world with impressive volume, Dante Moretti, a man feared across 5 states, a man who had ordered violence without blinking and buried enemies without remorse, held his daughter for the first time and wept without a single trace of shame. "She has your eyes," Elena said, exhausted and radiant, watching him cradle the baby against his chest with a gentleness that would have shocked every soldier in his organization. "She has your stubbornness," Dante said, laughing through tears he made no attempt to hide. "You should have heard her in there. Never met anyone louder about being inconvenienced. Takes after her father in that regard too, Elena said, smiling. You've never once accepted an inconvenience quietly in your life. They named her Sophia, after Dante's grandmother, a woman who had died before Vittorio's cruelty had fully calcified into the man he'd eventually become. And holding his daughter in the hospital room that had, weeks earlier, nearly become the site of her mother's murder, Dante Moretti understood with absolute clarity that whatever remained of his father's cruel legacy ended here, with this child, born of love rather than leverage, protected rather than sacrificed. Sophia was 3 months old when Dante finally asked again. He'd waited, deliberately, patiently, through the newborn haze of sleepless nights and the slow, tender rebuilding of a relationship that had been interrupted for a decade, wanting to be certain, when he finally asked, that Eleanor's answer would come from nothing but the clear, unclouded love that had somehow survived everything both their families had thrown against it. He chose the same terrace where they'd reunited 8 months before the accident, the private balcony overlooking the lake where a charity gala had once given 2 grieving people an unexpected second chance neither had believed they deserved. He'd had it transformed for the occasion, string lights woven through the railings, a small table set for 2, and, tucked in his jacket pocket, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother Sophia, the same woman his daughter now carried the name of. "You're being mysterious," Elena said, arriving on the terrace in the soft blue dress he'd once told her 10 years ago was his favourite colour, on her, Sophia asleep against her shoulder in a carrier that had become almost an extension of her body these last 3 months. "I've earned the right to a little mystery," Dante said, taking the baby gently so Elena's hands were free, settling Sophia against his own shoulder with the practiced ease of a man who had, in 3 short months, become entirely devoted to the small, demanding creature who ruled his household more completely than any rival family ever had. Dante. Elena's eyes had already found the ring box on the table, and her breath caught audibly. 10 years ago, Dante said, I stood in an apartment above my father's restaurant and told you I was going to marry you one day, that nothing our families threw at us would ever be strong enough to keep us apart. I was wrong about the part where nothing would keep us apart. Our families very nearly succeeded. But I was right about everything else. I have loved you since I was 20 years old. I loved you through 10 years of believing you'd left me. I loved you the moment I pulled you out of that wreckage and realized the universe had somehow, impossibly, given me a second chance I never thought I'd get. He knelt carefully, one arm still cradling their sleeping daughter, and opened the ring box with his free hand. You once told me you wanted our wedding to be a choice made out of love and safety, not fear, Dante said. Enzo Conti is gone. Marco is an ally, not an enemy. My father's lies are buried where they belong, and there is nothing left in this city that threatens you, or Sophia, or the life I want to build with both of you. So I'm asking you now, Elena Marchetti, with nothing but love standing between us, will you marry me? Elena was crying before he finished the question, the particular unguarded tears of a woman who had spent a decade believing this exact moment had been stolen from her permanently, only to discover it had simply been waiting patiently for the world to clear a path back to it. Yes, she said, dropping to her knees in front of him so they were level, framing his face with both hands. Yes, Dante, 1,000 times yes. I have wanted to say yes to you since I was 19 years old. I'm just grateful the universe finally let me. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that, for the first time in 10 years, were completely steady, and kissed her slowly, deliberately, their sleeping daughter cradled safely between them, the lake spread out dark and glittering beyond the terrace railing, indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding in its light. "I love you," Elena murmured against his lips. "I have never stopped, not for a single day." "I know," Dante said, resting his forehead against hers, breathing her in the way he dreamed of doing for 10 long years. "I never stopped either, not for a single day, not even when I thought I'd never see you again." Below them, the city continued its restless, dangerous churn. 5 families still balanced in their uneasy peace, 100 smaller conflicts still simmering in 100 other corners of Dante's world. But on this terrace, in this single suspended moment, none of it mattered. Only the woman in his arms, the daughter sleeping against his chest, and the decade of stolen time finally, fully repaid. The wedding took place the following spring, on the same lakefront where Dante had first learned as a boy of 20 exactly how deeply he was capable of loving someone. Not the terrace of the penthouse this time, but the gardens of the Moretti family estate, transformed for the occasion with the kind of extravagant, unrestrained beauty that Vittorio Moretti, in all his calculating cruelty, would never have understood the value of. Marco Conti attended as a guest of honor, seated in the front row beside Salvatore Marchetti, the 2 men who had once represented opposing forces in Elena's life, now bound together by genuine friendship forged in the fire of a shared fight against a common enemy. Nico stood as Dante's best man, and Sophia, 18 months old and utterly unbothered by the significance of the occasion, spent most of the ceremony trying to eat the flowers from her small basket, drawing quiet laughter from every row of guests. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said, and Dante did, slowly, thoroughly. 10 years of longing finally, completely resolved in the simple, sacred permission of a wedding kiss. That evening, as the reception spilled out across the estate's gardens under strings of golden light, Dante found a quiet moment alone with Elena near the fountain his father had once installed, indifferent to the schemes that had been plotted in its shadow for 30 years. "Do you ever think about how different this could have gone?" Elena asked, watching Sophia toddle unsteadily across the grass under the watchful eye of her new grandfather, Salvatore, who had moved to Chicago permanently after the wedding to be close to his daughter and granddaughter. "If you hadn't been driving down that street that night, if Enzo's plan had worked." "Every day," Dante admitted. "I think about it every single day, and every single day I'm grateful the universe decided, after 10 years of taking things from both of us, to finally give something back." "It wasn't the universe," Eleanor said, smiling, leaning into his shoulder. "It was you, slowing the car down because the roads were slick. If you hadn't been paying attention that night, I was always paying attention," Dante said quietly. "For 10 years, some part of me never stopped looking for you, Eleanor, even after I told myself I'd given up. I think I would have found my way back to you eventually, one way or another. The universe just happened to be efficient about it."
She laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, in a way it hadn't been the night he'd pulled her from the wreckage of her car, a woman who had finally, fully shed the fear that had lived behind her eyes for a decade.
A year later, they welcomed a second child, a son they named Vittorio. Not, Dante had explained carefully to Elena, in honor of his father's memory, but as a deliberate act of reclamation, a refusal to let a name that had once been synonymous with cruelty and betrayal remain forever stained by the man who'd carried it. Their son would grow up knowing a different Vittorio, a name redeemed by an entirely different kind of legacy, one built on protection instead of leverage, on love instead of debt, on a father who had learned through the hardest possible lesson exactly what his own father had gotten wrong about power. The Moretti and Conti families, once bound together by a treaty built on threats and forced marriages, found themselves a decade later genuinely allied, not through fear, but through the quiet, ordinary friendship of two men who had once stood together against a common enemy and discovered, in the aftermath, that they preferred peace to the exhausting machinery of suspicion their families had maintained for a generation. Marco eventually found the courage to bring the man he loved to a Moretti family Christmas, and Dante, watching Sofia and Vittorio chase each other around the tree while Marco laughed freely for what looked like the first time in his entire adult life, understood that the world his children were inheriting bore almost no resemblance to the one he and Elena had once been forced apart by. 10 years after a black sedan had run a pregnant stranger off a rain-slicked Chicago street, Dante Moretti stood in the garden of his family's estate, his wife's hand in his children's laughter carrying across grounds that had once been haunted by his father's ledgers and his father's lies, and understood, with the complete and unshakable certainty of a man who had rebuilt his entire life from the wreckage of a decade-old betrayal, that everything he had ever truly wanted had been waiting for him all along. He had spent 10 years believing he'd lost the only love of his life to circumstances beyond his control. He had been given, instead, a second chance most people never receive, and this time, nothing on earth would ever be strong enough to take it from him again.